Welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Today we'll be continuing our series on Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations with our 8th read in Book 5, Chapter 2, Part 2. Chapter 2 entitled Of the Sources of the General or Public Revenue of the Society, and Part 2 entitled Of Taxes. Part 2 is very long, and it's broken up into several articles and subsections, and when I get to the end of an article or end of a subsection or beginning of an article or subsection, I'll let you know. Just for context purposes, we're going to rewind one paragraph and just open with the closing paragraph from our previous read for the sake of providing context for continuity. So without further ado, high taxes, sometimes by diminishing the consumption of the taxed commodities, and sometimes by encouraging smuggling, frequently afford a smaller revenue to government than what might be drawn from more moderate taxes. When the diminution of revenue is the effect of the diminution of consumption, there can be but one remedy, and that is the lowering of the tax. When the diminution of the revenue is the effect of the encouragement given to smuggling, it may perhaps be remedied in two ways, either by diminishing the temptation to smuggle or by increasing the difficulty of smuggling. The temptation to smuggle can only be diminished by lowering the tax, and the difficulty of smuggling can be increased only by establishing that system of administration which is most proper for preventing it. The excise laws, it appears, I believe, from experience, obstruct and embarrass the operations of the smuggler much more effectually than those of the customs. By introducing into the customs a system of administration as similar to that of the excise as the nature of the different duties will admit, the difficulty of smuggling might be very much increased. This alteration, it has been supposed by many people, might very easily be brought about. The importer of commodities liable to any duties of customs, it has been said, might at his option be allowed either to carry them to his own private warehouse or to lodge them in a warehouse provided either at his own expense or at that of the public, but under the key of the custom house officer, and never to be opened but in his presence. If the merchant carried them to his own private warehouse, the duties to be immediately paid, and never afterwards to be drawn back, and that warehouse to be at all times subject to the visit and examination of the custom house officer in order to ascertain how far the quantity contained in it corresponded with that for which the duty had been paid. If he carried them to the public warehouse, no duty to be paid till they were taken out for home consumption. If taken out for exportation, to be duty-free, proper security being always given that they should be so exported. The dealers in those particular commodities, either by wholesale or retail, to be at all times subject to the visit and examination of the custom house officer, and to be obliged to justify by proper certificates the payment of the duty upon the whole quantity contained in their shops or warehouses. What are called the excise duties upon rum imported are at present levied in this manner, and in the same system of administration might perhaps be extended to all duties upon goods imported, provided always that those duties were, like the duties of excise, confined to a few sorts of goods of the most general use and consumption. If they were extended to almost all sorts of goods, as at present, public warehouses of sufficient extent could not easily be provided, and goods of very delicate nature, or of which the preservation required much care and attention, could not safely be trusted by the merchant in any warehouse but his own. If by such a system of administration smuggling, to any considerable extent, could be prevented even under pretty high duties, and if every duty was occasionally either heightened or lowered according as it was most likely, either on the one hand or the other, to afford the greatest revenue to the state, taxation being always employed as an instrument of revenue and never a monopoly, it seems not improbable that a revenue, at least equal to the present neat revenue of the customs, might be drawn from duties upon the importation of only a few sorts of goods of the most general use and consumption, and that the duties of customs might thus be brought to the same degree of simplicity, certainty, and precision as those of excise. What the revenue at present loses by drawbacks upon the exportation of foreign goods, which are afterwards relanded and consumed at home, would under this system be saved altogether. If to this saving, which would alone be very considerable, were added the abolition of all bounties upon the exportation of home produce, and all cases in which those bounties were not in reality drawbacks of some duties of excise which had before been advanced, it cannot well be doubted but that the neat revenue of customs might, after an alteration of this kind, be fully equal to what it had ever been before. If by such a charge of system the public revenue suffered no loss, the trade and manufactures of the country would certainly gain a very considerable advantage. The trade in the commodities not taxed, by far the greatest number, would be perfectly free, and might be carried on to and from all parts of the world with every possible advantage. Among those commodities would be comprehended all the necessaries of life and all the materials of manufacture. So far as the free importation of the necessaries of life reduced their average money price in the home market, it would reduce the money price of labor, but without reducing in any respect its real recompense. The value of money is in proportion to the quantity of necessaries of life which it will purchase. That of the necessaries of life is altogether independent of the quantity of money which can be had for them. The reduction in the money price of labor would necessarily be attended with a proportional one in that of all home manufactures, which would thereby gain some advantage in all foreign markets. The price of some manufactures would be reduced in a still greater proportion by the free importation of the raw materials. If raw silk could be imported from China and Indostan duty-free, the silk manufacturers in England could greatly undersell those of both France and Italy. There would be no occasion to prohibit the importation of foreign silks and velvets. The cheapness of their goods would secure to our own workmen not only the possessions of the home market, but a very great command of the foreign market. Even the trade in the commodities taxed would be carried on with much more advantage than at present. If those commodities were delivered out of the public warehouse for foreign exportation, being in this case exempted from all taxes, the trade in them would be perfectly free. The carrying trade in all sorts of goods would under this system enjoy every possible advantage. If those commodities were delivered out for home consumption, the importer not being obliged to advance the tax till he had an opportunity of selling his goods either to some dealer or to some consumer, he could always afford to sell them cheaper than if he had been obliged to advance it at the moment of importation. Under the same taxes, the foreign trade of consumption, even in the taxed commodities, might in this manner be carried on with much more advantage than it can at present. It was the object of the famous excise scheme of Sir Robert Walpole to establish, with regard to wine and tobacco, a system not very unlike that which is here proposed. But though the bill which was then brought into Parliament comprehended those two commodities only, it was generally supposed to be meant as an introduction to a more extensive scheme of the same kind. Faction, combined with the interest of smuggling merchants, raised so violent, though so unjust, a clamor against that bill, that the minister thought proper to drop it, and from a dread of exciting a clamor of the same kind, none of his successors have dared to resume the project. The duties upon foreign luxuries imported for home consumption, though they sometimes fall upon the poor, fall principally upon people of middling or more than middling fortune. Such are, for example, the duties upon foreign wines, upon coffee, chocolate, tea, sugar, etc. The duties upon the cheaper luxuries of home produce destined for home consumption fall pretty equally upon people of all ranks in proportion to their respective expense. The poor pay the duties upon malt, hops, beer, and ale upon their own consumption, the rich upon both their own consumption and that of their servants. The whole consumption of the inferior ranks of people, or of those below the middling rank, it must be observed, is in every country much greater, not only in quantity but in value, than that of the middling and of those above the middling rank. The whole expense of the inferior is much greater than that of the superior ranks. In the first place, almost the whole capital of every country is annually distributed among the inferior ranks of people as the wages of productive labor. Secondly, a great part of the revenue arising from both the rent of land and the profits of stock is annually distributed among the same rank in the wages and maintenance of menial servants and other unproductive laborers. Thirdly, some part of the profits of stock belongs to the same rank as a revenue arising from the employment of their small capitals. The amount of the profits annually made by small shopkeepers, tradesmen, and retailers of all kinds is everywhere very considerable and makes a very considerable portion of the annual produce. Fourthly and lastly, some part even of the rent of land belongs to the same rank, a considerable part to those who are somewhat below the middling rank, and a small part even to the lowest rank, common laborers sometimes possessing in property an acre or two of land. Though the expense of those inferior ranks of people, therefore, taking them individually is very small, yet the whole mass of it, taking them collectively, amounts always to by much the largest portion of the whole expense of society. What remains of the annual produce of the land and labor of the country for the consumption of the superior ranks, being always much less, not only in quantity, but in value. The taxes upon expense, therefore, which fall chiefly upon that of the superior ranks of people, upon the smaller portion of the annual produce, are likely to be much less productive than either those which fall indifferently upon the expense of all ranks, or even those which fall chiefly upon the inferior ranks, than either those which fall indifferently upon the whole annual produce, or those which fall chiefly upon the larger portion of it. The excise upon the materials and manufacture of home-made fermented and spirituous liquors is accordingly, of all the different taxes upon expense, by far the most productive, and this branch of the excise falls very much, perhaps principally, upon the expense of the common people. In the year which ended on the 5th of July, 1775, the gross produce of this branch of the excise amounted to £3,341,837 9 shillings 9 pence. It must always be remembered, however, that it is the luxurious and not the necessary expense of the inferior ranks of people that ought ever to be taxed. The final payment of any tax upon their necessary expense would fall altogether upon the superior ranks of people, upon the smaller portion of the annual produce, and not upon the greater. Such a tax must in all cases either raise the wages of labor or lessen the demand for it. It could not raise the wages of labor without throwing the final payment of the tax upon the superior ranks of people. It could not lessen the demand for labor without lessening the annual produce of the land and labor of the country, the fund from which all taxes must finally be paid. Whatever might be the state to which a tax of this kind reduced the demand for labor, it must always raise wages higher than they otherwise would be in that state, and the final payment of this enhancement of wages must in all cases fall upon the superior ranks of people. Fermented liquors brewed and spirituous liquors distilled, not for sale but for private use, are not in Great Britain liable to any duties of excise. This exemption, of which the object is to save private families from the odious visit and examination of the tax-gatherer, occasions the burden of those duties to fall frequently much lighter upon the rich than upon the poor. It is not, indeed, very common to distill for private use, though it is done sometimes. But in the country, many middling and almost all rich and great families brew their own beer. Their strong beer, therefore, costs them 8 shillings a barrel less than it costs the common brewer, who must have his profit upon the tax, as well as upon all the other expense which he advances. Such families, therefore, must drink their beer at least 9 or 10 shillings a barrel cheaper than any liquor of the same quantity can be drunk by the common people, to whom it is everywhere more convenient to buy their beer, by little and little, from the brewery or the alehouse. Malt, in the same manner, that is made for the use of a private family, is not liable to the visit or examination of the tax-gatherer, but in this case the family must compound at 7 shillings and 6 pence a head for the tax. 7 shillings and 6 pence are equal to the excise upon 10 bushels of malt, a quantity fully equal to what all the different members of any sober family, men, women, and children, are at an average likely to consume. But in rich and great families, where country hospitality is much practiced, the malt liquors consumed by the members of the family make but a small part of the consumption of the house. Either on account of this composition, however, or for other reasons, it is not near so common to malt as to brew for private use. It is difficult to imagine any equitable reason why those who either brew or distill for private use should not be subject to a composition of the same kind. A greater revenue than what is at present drawn from all the heavy taxes upon malt, beer, and ale must be raised, it has frequently been said, by a much lighter tax upon malt. The opportunities of defrauding the revenue being much greater in a brewery than in a malt house, and those who brew for private use being exempted from all duties or composition for duties, which is not the case with those who malt for private use. In the Porter Brewery of London, a quarter of malt is commonly brewed into more than 2 barrels and a half, sometimes into 3 barrels of porter. The different taxes upon malt amount to 6 shillings a quarter, those upon strong beer and ale to 8 shillings a barrel. In the Porter Brewery, therefore, the different taxes upon malt, beer, and ale amount to between 26 and 30 shillings upon the produce of a quarter of malt. In the Country Brewery for common country sale, a quarter of malt is seldom brewed into less than 2 barrels of strong and 1 barrel of small beer, frequently into 2 barrels and a half of strong beer. The different taxes upon small beer amount to 1 shilling and 4 pence a barrel. In the Country Brewery, therefore, the taxes upon malt, beer, and ale seldom amount to less than 23 shillings and 4 pence, frequently to 26 shillings upon the produce of a quarter of malt. Taking the whole kingdom at an average, therefore, the whole amount of the duties upon malt, beer, and ale cannot be estimated at less than 24 or 25 shillings upon the produce of a quarter of malt. But by taking off all the different duties upon beer and ale, and by tripling the malt tax, or by raising it from 6 to 18 shillings upon the quarter of malt, a greater revenue, it is said, might be raised by this single tax than what is at present drawn from all those heavier taxes. Under the old malt tax, indeed, is comprehended a tax of 4 shillings upon the hogshead of cider, and another of 10 shillings upon the barrel of mum. In 1774, the tax upon cider produced only 3,083 pounds, 6 shillings, 8 pence. It probably fell somewhat short of its usual amount, all the different taxes upon cider having that year produced less than ordinary. The tax upon mum, though much heavier, is still less productive on account of the smaller consumption of that liquor. But to balance whatever may be the ordinary amount of those two taxes, there is comprehended under what is called the country excise, first, the old excise of 6 shillings and 8 pence upon the hogshead of cider, secondly, a like tax of 6 shillings and 8 pence upon the hogshead of verjuice, thirdly, another of 8 shillings and 9 pence upon the hogshead of vinegar, and lastly, a fourth tax of 11 pence upon the gallon of meat or metheglin. The produce of those different taxes will probably much more than counterbalance that of the duties imposed by what is called the annual malt tax upon cider and mum. Malt is consumed not only in the brewery of beer and ale, but in the manufacture of low wines and spirits. If the malt tax were to be raised to 18 shillings upon the quarter, it might be necessary to make some abatement in the different excises which are imposed upon those particular sorts of low wines and spirits of which malt makes any part of the materials. In what are called malt spirits, it makes commonly but a third part of the materials, the other 2/3 being either raw barley, or 1/3 barley and 1/3 wheat. In the distillery of malt spirits, both the opportunity and the temptation to smuggle are much greater than either in a brewery or in a malt house. The opportunity on account of the smaller bulk and greater value of the commodity, and the temptation on account of the superior height of the duties, which amount to 3 shillings 10 2/3 pence upon the gallon of spirits. By increasing the duties upon malt and reducing those upon the distillery, both the opportunities and the temptation to smuggle would be diminished, which might occasion a still further augmentation of revenue. It has for some time past been the policy of Great Britain to discourage the consumption of spirituous liquors on account of their supposed tendency to ruin the health and to corrupt the morals of the common people. According to this policy, the abatement of the taxes upon the distillery ought not to be so great as to reduce in any respect the price of those liquors. Spirituous liquors might remain as dear as ever, while at the same time the wholesome and invigorating liquors of beer and ale might be considerably reduced in the price. The people might thus be in part relieved from one of the burdens of which they at present complain the most, while at the same time the revenue might be considerably augmented. The objections of Dr. Davenant to this alteration in the present system of excise duties seem to be without foundation. Those objections are that the tax, instead of dividing itself at present pretty equally upon the profit of the maltster, upon that of the brewer, and upon that of the retailer, would, so far as it affected profit, fall altogether upon that of the maltster, that the maltster could not so easily get back the amount of the tax in the advanced price of his malt as the brewer and retailer in the advanced price of their liquor, and that so heavy a tax upon malt might reduce the rent and profit of barley land. No tax can ever reduce for any considerable time the rate of profit in any particular trade, which must always keep its level with other trades in the neighborhood. The present duties upon malt, beer, and ale do not affect the profits of the dealers in those commodities, who all get back the tax with an additional profit in the enhanced price of their goods. A tax indeed may render the goods upon which it is imposed so dear as to diminish the consumption of them. But the consumption of malt is in malt liquors, and a tax of 18 shillings upon the quarter of malt could not well render those liquors dearer than the different taxes, amounting to 24 or 25 shillings due at present. Those liquors, on the contrary, would probably become cheaper, and the consumption of them would be more likely to increase than to diminish. Let's do one more paragraph. It is not very easy to understand why it should be more difficult for the maltster to get back 18 shillings in the advanced price of his malt than it is at present for the brewer to get back 24, 25, sometimes 30 shillings on that of his liquor. The maltster, indeed, instead of a tax of 6 shillings, would be obliged to advance one of 18 shillings upon every quarter of malt. But the brewer is at present obliged to advance a tax of 24 or 25, sometimes 30 shillings upon every quarter of malt which he brews. It could not be more inconvenient for the maltster to advance a lighter tax than it is at present for the brewer to advance a heavier one. The maltster doth not always keep in his granaries a stock of malt, which it will require a longer time to dispose of than the stock of beer and ale which the brewer frequently keeps in his cellars. The former, therefore, may frequently get the returns of his money as soon as the latter. But whatever inconvenience might arise to the maltster from being obliged to advance a heavier tax, it could easily be remedied by granting him a few months' longer credit than is at present commonly given to the brewer. All right, I think we're going to have to call it quits there because that's about where I want to be on terms of time. So we will continue with Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. We will continue with Book 5, Chapter 2, Part 2, and our next read in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. So until then, this has been Mike, signing off.